All right. Good afternoon and welcome to today's insight session on risk culture. APRA's view is that sound risk culture is a core element in an effective risk management framework. Risk culture refers to the norms of behaviour for individuals and groups within an organisation that determine the collective ability to identify, understand, openly discuss and act on the organisation's current and future risk. Today, Fahmi will be providing some insights on APRA's recent risk culture information paper, including what regulated institutions can expect from APRA in this field in the future. Fahmi was appointed as APRA's Head of Governance, Culture and Remuneration in August 2015. He is responsible for leading the development of APRA's thinking, supervisory practices and industry engagement on these interrelated topics. Fahmi's career at APRA spans over 16 years, primarily in the role of a frontline supervisor. Please join me in welcoming Fahmi.
Thanks, Jen. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm going to talk you through APRA's risk culture paper and provide you with some more insights to what was in the paper. Now, last year was a pretty extraordinary year, 2016. Brexit, Trump, and amongst all of that, APRA took the time to produce a dedicated publication just on risk culture. Now, for many of you, I think, in your day-to-day lives probably have a fair bit to do with APRA. And in your interaction with APRA or thinking about the regulations and guidance that we put out, no doubt you're thinking about capital, pricing, reserving, balance sheet management, those sorts of things. So for a number of people, it was a bit of a surprise that APRA came out with a paper on risk culture specifically. So I want to talk you through the background as to why it is that APRA, the prudential regulator, is interested in culture, and talk you through where we've arrived at in terms of our work in this space. So today, I'll talk through the background. I'll give you some more insights in terms of what we've seen across industries that we supervise in terms of state of play on risk culture. I'll also talk through, at the end, what to expect from us going forward in this space. So hopefully, most of you here, if not all of you, are fully familiar with what we experienced through the GFC, particularly overseas. Now, with a bit of time behind us, the aftermath of many of the failures that we saw within the financial sector overseas, as well as the near failures or bailouts that we saw in foreign jurisdictions, the central element driving many of those issues was actually found to be culture. They were culture in terms of their root cause. That, of course, has required regulators around the world to stand back and go, well, if culture's at the root cause, maybe we should be doing something more in this space, because traditionally our focus has been around financial management, capital management, credit risk, market risk, risk management itself. We actually, traditionally, regulators as a population around the world have not spent a great deal of time thinking about culture specifically. But it's funny in that if you talk to most supervisors, for supervisors at APRA, some of our peer regulators overseas, a supervisor would tell you, actually, when I think about assessing the risk of my institution, there is something about the culture which permeates their thinking of their assessment of risk. They're just not able to really label it, talk about it in a deep way, but they get a sense of when they're interacting with an institution, some of them, maybe you guys on the other side of the table, but when they get a sense of when we're asking a question and somebody's defensive, somebody's aggressive, evasive, that's actually information. We're not just looking at numbers that we get from returns. We're not just looking at policies that we look at. We're not just looking at frameworks. We're looking at how is it that the institution is engaging with us. But as I said, to this point in time, we don't have a detailed framework through which we can teach and educate our supervisors to utilise that information in a way that gives us coherent and systematic views around the culture of an organisation. So, as a key lesson learned of the GFC, many regulators are doing something in this space. But I would add to you that the GFC wasn't the first time regulators have realised culture could be a real issue that's driving outcomes at financial institutions. HIH, that's the largest financial services failure we've seen in a long, long time. That was in 2001. If you go through the Royal Commission report, culture was at the heart of its issues, which ultimately took it down. 2004, In a very public episode, NAB, National Australia Bank, had a foreign currency options, what you'd call a fiasco in terms of traders undertaking false trades and manipulating their positions, all sorts of things which resulted in large losses for NAB. NAB at that point in time, to their credit, published our report, which you can see up there, in which we identified culture being the root cause of the issues that they faced. And in fact, we had a whole chapter in this paper saying that culture, NAB really had to work on its culture to get past these issues. So we've known actually for a long time that culture really is a core driver of outcomes for financial institutions. But post-GFC, this is where the global response has effectively landed. In 2009, on the left-hand side, what you see there is a paper on compensation practices. This was guidance that the FSB, Financial Stability Board, produced. So the FSB you can think of as almost like an umbrella agency for all regulators around the world, and particularly for those G20 countries who sign up to the G20, they look to try and harmonise these requirements and standards into their own practice. But 2009 was when that compensation paper came out, and that was really the first global response. And that was the idea there was to really try and address the remuneration practices of financial institutions with a couple of core principles. One, the guidance was being very clear in terms of making sure that where there was variable remuneration, it had to be aligned to the financial management and outcomes of a financial institution. So there are all sorts of things raised in this paper, things like clawback, malus, deferral periods, and those sorts of things. But another important paper, and one that's particularly important for us today, is on the right-hand side. And this is a guidance paper for regulators on risk culture. And this really, for the first time, the FSB came out with a paper saying, as a prudential regulator, as a conduct regulator, you want to be thinking about these sorts of things from a cultural perspective to help you do your work. And this paper covered the classic things that I think many of you would associate discussions around culture to be: tone at the top, accountability, challenge, effective communication, as well as incentives. So APRA's response to those sorts of issues were a couple of pieces of prudential regulation and standards. So CPS 510, our governance standard, in 2010, we included remuneration requirements in there. We included principles such as incentive arrangements must be aligned to the long-term financial health of the organisation, and they also must support the risk management framework of the institution. And in 2015, we introduced a new risk management prudential standard, CPS 220, and in that prudential standard, we included for the first time an obligation for all ADIs, authorised deposit-taking institutions, and insurers, for their boards to form a view on the risk culture of their organisation. So that's how we effectively adopted the FSB principles into our requirements. But of course, part of that responding to regulators doing more in the culture space was also to build a team. So in 2015, we created and established a new team called Governance, Culture and Remuneration. And the idea was that we would try and house together in one unit expertise on those three topics, which we see as highly interrelated. The reality has been, though, as I've just mentioned, work on culture from a regulatory perspective had not been particularly insightful or deep. And so we spent basically since mid-2015 really thinking about culture, in particular risk culture specifically, as opposed to remuneration or governance. I'll come back to what we're doing in governance and REM in a moment, but we've really tried to study hard culture. And so this gives you a bit of a sense as to what we've done. We've engaged heavily with the institutions that we supervise at the director level, at the executive level. We've engaged with ASIC, consulting firms, academics in this space, as well as foreign regulators to really get a better sense of what's important in this space, what are the key things to be thinking about, and what does it mean from a prudential regulatory perspective to be thinking about culture and risk culture. So let's get to what we found, because I think here's where the interesting things start to emerge. So key observations that we found as part of our research into risk culture in particular is that post the introduction of CPS 220, there's a hell of a lot of work taking place in this space right now, which is great to see. The other side of that equation, though, is to say, well, maybe institutions were not doing enough in this space. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think we've certainly noticed a difference across jurisdictions. If you go to Europe, in particular, the way institutions are responding to the need to think about culture is really quite different to what we see in Australia. We didn't have the huge issues that, in particular, Europe had. And so we're seeing a degree of complacency here, where we've had many institutions say to us, it's not that big of a deal here, so don't put on European solutions into what's happening in Australia. Our view would be that there are lessons to be learnt here, and let's try and get ahead of this. Our economy has been amazing over 25 years. A recession is not far off, I'm sure. So the question is, how well prepared are we as a financial industry to cope and weather that storm? I think if you've got a poor culture, I think you're going to be in trouble. So we're trying to get ahead of that, making sure that institutions are actually well prepared, understand their cultures well, and are hopefully confident in that the culture that they do have in place is something that's going to help them through bad times as well as good. The box on the immediate right, clarity of purpose and values, is an interesting one. So in talking to some of the institutions who had really spent some time thinking about this, this always came up, values and purpose. And these institutions saw that as a pretty critical focal point for them to be able to really articulate across the organisation what is important to them. Because ultimately, culture, another way to think about culture is it simply represents what's valued in an organisation. And as I think you all know, all companies have value statements, they have purpose statements. But for many organisations and many firms actually that we spoke to, they said, look, actually they seem to be just pieces of paper. People don't seem to pay a lot of attention to them. What's fascinating is that in many of these purpose and value statements, you see very, very similar types of wording, integrity, collaboration, professionalism, those sorts of things, which is great and well-meaning. But when we really pushed hard for some firms to articulate, so what really is valued here? What are the sorts of things that get discussed all the time? The things that came up all the time, profitability, return on equity, those things came up, yet they don't appear in any type of value statements or purpose statements. Yet those firms who were attuned to that were saying, you know what, if we do think about it, they're probably the things we value quite highly, and perhaps we're prioritising them in certain circumstances above other things. Is that right or not? That's the question we're putting back to institutions. Is that right or not? Is that what you're comfortable with? So the role of purpose and values, I think for some organisations who are further down the line in terms of maturity of thinking in this space, are really trying to think through how can they put in place values and purpose that are meaningful and actually truly reflect what the board feels is important, the senior executives feel are important for the organisation. Another point which is probably pretty obvious is leadership, seen as really critical in terms of driving and influencing culture. Perhaps less so, and this is an area that we're pushing a lot more in, is the board itself. A lot of the work, a lot of the focus that we've seen is really bottom down. So boards saying to executives, can you tell us what the culture is like of this part of the business? Can you do this study here or there? What we're also saying, and we're of the view of, is that the board can be hugely influential on the culture of an organisation. The way the board interacts themselves, the way they make decisions, the way they interact with management when information comes up. Bad news, good news, how do they respond to that? And what signals is that giving to the organisation that then gets filtered down? We think that's an emerging area there where I think further focus is required. Because at the moment, right now, it is just purely, it seems to be just down, not at the board level in terms of focus on culture. Another interesting point on the bottom left-hand side is that, generally speaking, the CRO seems to be driving a lot of the work in the culture space. We think that's reflective of the fact that this is a relatively new space, and I think it makes sense that the CROs are given the sort of mandate to go, tell us what to do, show us the way. But what we would say is that for a mature organisation when it comes to risk culture, we would expect, in fact, not the risk function to be leading this work. It should be the business lines. For a financial institution to own risk, you're in the business line. The business line owns that risk, and therefore they actually own the risk culture of the organisation. They're the ones that should feel passionate about this. They're the ones who should be building it into every single interaction that they have, whether it's customers, internally. Risk culture's got to be at the top of their minds rather than risk functions. So what we're really seeing here is that there's an education process that's happening, I think, within Australia, where the CROs are kind of leading at this point. What we're trying to tell industry is that, well, that's all well and good for now, but over time, for an institution to say to us that, yes, our risk culture is mature, we'd be expecting to have all of those conversations, not with the CROs, but with the business lines instead. So when we engage with institutions to say we want to talk about risk culture, we said to them, we don't care who you send. Send us who you think is the most appropriate to send to this meeting. In almost every case, we had the CRO and the head of HR attend the meeting. That was great. They gave us their insights and whatnot. But there were a handful of occasions in which the entity's CEO turned up. And in those meetings, it was absolutely clear risk culture was critically important to them. They did all the talking. They felt passionate about it. There weren't going to be discussions or debate about funding for initiatives around culture. It was going to happen. The difference was really stark in terms of take-up. So from our perspective, a really good barometer for us is who has bought into risk culture? Is it the CEO? Is it the board? Or is it just a risk function talking? That gives us a sense of where an institution is in terms of maturity. The next point is HR systems. So in talking to the heads of HR, I mean, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, they've got some really amazing data to be able to help think through cultural types of issues and perhaps provide some insights on what's happening around the organisation. And one institution did say to us that had we put together our HR information on some certain traders that they had in their organisation, along with risk management metrics, we could have foreseen that were going to be issues that were going to emerge, but they found that out too late. Those traders had committed some things which ended up resulting in them being fired, but HR was saying if we had combined all of this data beforehand, we would have had some lead indicators that would have presented some red flags for us to act against these traders sooner than them detrimentally impacting the institution. But the issue that we came across was that, particularly for large institutions, systems are very disparate and wide, and often they don't talk to each other, and that can be very difficult, time-consuming and expensive to try and fix. So there are some barriers to make that happen, but nonetheless it's being acknowledged. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier in that last box to the right, risk culture assessments are primarily at the moment being undertaken on a business line level or a team level unit. It's not really being undertaken at the senior executive level. So in our view, that's a cohort that should absolutely be looked at from a cultural perspective. When they come and make their decisions on a weekly basis or how often they meet, they're making really critical decisions for the organisation. What is the culture like around that table, that senior executive table? CEO and direct reports. Who challenges? Who supports? Who says nothing? Is the CEO open to challenge? Those sorts of dynamics, to understand that at a senior executive level really gives you an insight as to how things are done in the organisation and what's valued. And the same goes for the board as well. So let's move on, and this is really just a diagram of some of the concepts I've spoken about. But a key point I think for you to take away, if it's not already clear to you, is the blue circle, the organisational culture and risk culture. We're talking about the same thing here, but risk culture is purely about thinking about culture from a risk management lens. As a prudential regulator, that's what we're concerned about. We're concerned about how risks are managed because we want to make sure that institutions don't get into financial strife, which perhaps impedes their ability to meet their promises to depositors, policyholders and super fund members. And so which is why we try and, when we think about risk culture, all we're talking about here is organisational culture as it relates to risk management. Another important point here is risk management capability at the bottom. So we heard, and this is particularly true of the superannuation space, and we made this public in the paper, the degree of maturity around understanding risk management and then therefore risk culture is actually a really important point. You can have the best intentioned people you can have or you want, but if they don't understand risk, it actually doesn't matter. You need people who are competent in their jobs to understand, analyse, assess and make contributions around conveying information about risk. They may really identify with helping the super fund member out, the depositor out and whatnot, that's great. But unless they have that core competency, you cannot manage risk properly or you cannot identify it properly from a second line perspective. And so that to us is something we're pushing pretty hard. And for some organisations, this also comes into play around accountabilities. We're seeing a number of institutions having confused understandings of who owns the risk. Is it second line? Is it first line? And if you're in that position, our view would be you're in a pretty immature state of risk culture because that's not going to help anyone manage risk. You've got to be absolutely clear and have it bedded down who owns the risk. And as we've said, in our mind, that is clearly the first line. It's not the second line. The second line's job purely is to independently assess, monitor and advise the board and senior executive of risk positions. Let's move on to tools utilised. So we saw a range of methods of institutions employing to try and get a sense of what their culture was. And we've all been subject to this, surveys. That's clearly the most popular tool used by institutions, and it makes sense as to why. You can get across an organisation pretty easily, relatively cheaply. So you can get a good spread and feel for that. Some institutions have just stopped there. Our view would be you can't just stop there to get a proper understanding of what your risk culture is like. You need to employ some other methods. Focus groups and interviews are one way in which you can explore some of the themes coming out from a survey in more detail, and some institutions are absolutely using that. But some of the more interesting ones that we've come across in terms of tools was the top right-hand box, the sort of aggregate reporting of a whole stack of disparate data through which somebody's trying to make a case for proxy measures for culture. And some of the things that I'm sure you can think of, but some of the classic ones that we see are, so number of breaches, trading limit breaches, number of overdue outstanding internal items, number of code of conduct breaches, number of degrees of sick leave that you're seeing in a particular unit. All sorts of disparate types of information which somebody is trying to put together to say, when you put it all together, perhaps our culture is looking like this. I think the point here is that there is a range of data out there that can give you some insights. How you try and connect the dots is a really hard one. We haven't seen anyone that's solved that yet, but it may give you some indicators of how things are at, and then exploring a bit further from there. But relying on that purely is a difficult task, because as I've said, we haven't come across any institution that has done that, which is able to say, because of these, clearly we can see our culture is this. Internal audit, bottom left-hand corner. So this is an emerging trend where we're seeing internal audit being employed to provide views on culture as they do their audits. So for some organisations, that's purely been an extension of existing internal audit capability. Because they get across the entire organisation, I think some boards feel that could be useful. So when you do your audit, provide a view on culture, please. Other organisations have said, we don't think our internal auditors are capable and skilled, adequately skilled to be able to make an assessment on culture, so we're not going to get them to do that. Other firms have employed specialist skill sets in internal audit functions. Org psychs, in particular, feature, behavioural economists feature as well in some of these units that go out and do these assessments, specific risk culture assessments to provide insights to the audit committee and others across the organisation. So that's an emerging trend that we're seeing across the industry, here and overseas as well. Another method we've seen at a number of places is doing a review of the congruency of your strategy, your risk appetite, your policy settings. And this is really getting to this point around what is valued in the organisation. It's a good way to be able to test when you have your values and purpose statement saying a certain thing, is that truly reflected in what you do? So we've seen a number of these examples of these reviews being undertaken where we've seen some material changes as a result. So for instance, one organisation that did this, their core focus was customers. We want to be the customer's best friend. But what they were finding is that in some of their products that they were releasing to market, they were favouring new customers over their existing customers. And when they came back to it, they said, well, if we truly believe that our customers are our number one priority, why are we benefiting new customers over our existing customers? So they went and made some policy changes, and they said, never again are we going to discriminate effectively against our existing customers. They will always get some of the best rates that we have to new customers as well. That's a pretty tangible change as a result of doing this work. The last point here is diagnostic reviews by consultants. So this is a way in which firms can get access to skill sets that may not be readily available to them to go in and also provide hopefully an objective and independent view of their culture. So again, this comes back to utilising skill sets that we've seen in any case, skills such as organisational psychologists, and behavioural economists to come in and do some assessment and provide some feedback, which then the firm can do something with. So we're seeing greater use of that as well in the last 12 to 18 months. It's an important point. So what does the use of all these tools reflect? They reflect the fact that the industry, as far as we can see, is within this phase of identification and assessment. Right? It's about trying to understand what the culture is right now. We heard actually very little around cultural change or aspirational cultures. Organisations are still in this space, which, as I said, makes sense given this is a relatively new topic. But I've just got a quote from our risk culture paper here, because this is really important, I think, for all of us here who work in the financial services sector. That is, institutions consistently asserted to APRA that their risk cultures were broadly good or strong. They did, however, acknowledge that risk culture was an issue within their industry. So they kept saying, well, we're pretty good, but everyone else is bad. We got that consistently, despite the fact that the conversation just before they made this comment typically was, we're yet to understand what our culture is. You know, we're grappling to find out what that is. But when we asked them directly, so what's it like? They said, oh, it's good. Yeah. We need deeper analysis and understanding of this issue. And there's, I think, a big question around self-awareness within the financial services sector. I think that I was talking to a few people over lunch. I think we're talking about behaviours here. We're talking typically about things that, as finance professionals, we haven't traditionally spoken about. I'm an economist. Most people at APRA are economists, lawyers, finance professionals, actuaries. Our language traditionally, I've been at APRA for quite a while, has been capital, credit risk, market risk, financial metrics, those sorts of things are our day-to-day language. We rarely talk about, from a financial institution perspective, about behaviours, challenge, openness, those sorts of things. They don't come in as often as the traditional things we do. I suspect that's the same for the financial services sector as a whole. And so, first of all, recognising that we're talking about things that we may not be properly trained in yet or fully aware of is a starting point. And then we need to move on, because right now, as we've made clear to you, We don't think there's an accurate perception of where people are at. And this takes me to this picture here, and it's straight from Google, I think, an apple tree. So quite often you hear in the discourse publicly around culture and what's going on in the financial services sector, you hear about these bad apples. Who are these bad apples? And this, in my mind, is a clear connection to the previous point about self-awareness. So often when bad things happen, the immediate reaction that you hear from generally is, oh, that was some bad apples. We just need to get rid of the bad apples. Bad apples are a symptom of something. Bad apples do not operate on their own. They're cultivated, they're nurtured by tree, the root system, the branches. And so in that context, what I mean is a financial institution, the way it perhaps nurtures or fosters some of that bad apple behavior is just as important as a bad apple. And you can remove that bad apple, but if you've got the same sort of framework, same sort of culture in place that perhaps indirectly, perhaps explicitly, perhaps directly, is influencing individuals to act in a certain way, that's actually a critical problem. But it's actually very easy to be able to say it's a bad apple, get rid of them, we are done here. So we're trying to push harder about what are the root causes of that bad apple behavior. It's very rare, I think, that you find somebody intrinsically bad coming into an institution to say, I am going to come in from day one and breach my limits. I'm going to come in and do fraudulent trading. There's typically a rationale and pressure as to why they've found themselves in that position. And what is it about the organisation that is potentially fulfilling or supporting that type of behaviour? It could be unconscious or conscious. But something is happening in that space where that's where we're interested in, to make sure that actually for the future longevity of the institution, boards and senior executives are thinking about that issue, the root issue. Why is it that people were behaving this way? What is it that we could do that could potentially prevent that going forward? So, I appreciate you're not all actuaries here. I didn't realise that. I thought it would be a room full of actuaries. But I have some questions for you to ponder. Ponder based on what I've said today, and feel free to reach out to me afterwards if you have thoughts and views on this. But my question to you would be, how would you go about thinking about assessing the culture of your organisation? What data points would you be looking at? It's an interesting one, because when I think about data, when most people I think in the financial services sector think about data, I think of numbers. But actually, here's the big hint. The data here is not numbers. The data here are behaviours. What does data look like in that context? And often I've found actually a disconnect in trying to get people to understand more about culture. When I talk about data, I lose them. They're saying, give me the number, what's the risk culture score number? Tell me that. And I say, well, I can give you a descriptor of the behaviours I've seen, and that is just as valid data point as a number is in the context of capital or balance sheet management. But that's actually a pretty new concept for a lot of people who have worked in finance for a long time. So data does not just have to be numbers, particularly in the culture sphere. The other one is, okay, so once you have formed a view on what you think the culture is like at your place, even if it's within your team, the really important question is, why is that the case? Why is it that's the culture? Yes, it's a hard one to answer, but actually there's science that allows you to get into that space. There's a whole bunch of methodology that will enable you to think about, well, why is that the case? Because actually, it's only once you understand that will you be able to think about how we can make change, how we can make sustainable change going forward. Because if you're just making service level changes, the chances of that being sustainable over the long term is questionable, I would say. Okay, let's move on to what's next. So there's also time for some Q&A, hopefully a fair bit of time. Work plan for the governance, culture and remuneration team at APRA. In the culture space, we're about to embark on a series of pilot reviews. We've nominated a number of entities in which we will conduct these pilot reviews. And what we're trying to do here is roll out and test methodology of our own. So we're going to go out there and say, okay, so how would APRA go about assessing risk culture? I'll just give you some ideas of what we're thinking about. We're still working through our planning process. We haven't bedded anything down. But some of the approaches we're thinking about are asking boards to tell us, okay, give us a key strategic decision you guys have made over the last 12 months. Once they've picked that one, what we will try and do is basically isolate that decision and go throughout the genesis of that decision into the relevant business unit where that started from. And what we will do is we'll start at the board level and say, okay, when this decision came up, what was the discussion like at the board level? Who challenged, who was quiet, How long did it go for? What was the feeling like in the room? We'll do that on a collective basis at a board. We'll do that on an individual interview basis as well to get their feedback along those lines. We'll do the same thing for the senior executive committee. When this came up to you, what was the discussion like? Who did all the talking? Who challenged? Who was quiet? Was everyone comfortable with what was going on? And we basically take that approach all the way down to the bottom of the business division where the decision originated from. And that to us, we think will give us, that's one example of a methodology that will give you a sense of the culture of the place. It's a very different and foreign concept for APRA's approach to supervision, but we're trialling some things. So this is not to say this is going to be the end point for us. We're just going to see how it goes. But we think that's a really compelling way to think about how things are done in an organisation. But what this ultimately will enable us to do, and this is the second point on the culture frame, is ultimately where we need to get to as a prudential regulator, given the lessons learned from the GFC, is be in a position to understand cultures of organisations so that we're able to ascertain, well, what does that tell us about the riskiness of the institution? Fundamentally, this is what this is about for us, because we think the insights you can get from culture can provide some really meaningful forward-looking indicators of what's going to happen at the institution. If there's a poor risk culture, we should be more concerned about things like credit risk, market risk, capital management and whatnot. If there's a strong or a sound risk culture, I would say, we'd be less concerned. It's pretty much as simple as that. Remuneration is an interesting one. This is the one that gets a lot of headlines. Some people call this the sexy topic out of these three, but the team's about to engage on some serious piece of work this year. So we're doing a stock take of a range of things this year. One, we'll be doing a stock take of our requirements versus what's been happening around the world. We're one of the few regulators who haven't changed their remuneration requirements since we first introduced them in 2010. For those of you who are familiar with our requirements, they're very high level and principles based, not prescriptive at all. And most of our peer regulators have gone down a heavily prescriptive route. Whilst we're not in favour of prescription, there may be some use in doing that given what we're seeing in practice right now. And that's the second point of our work in REM this year. We'll be doing a pretty comprehensive review on what are the remuneration practices and outcomes that we're seeing across the industries that we supervise. And to give you an example, what we intend on doing is going out with information requests to a range of institutions, which will include the employment contracts of CEOs, senior executives, material risk takers, risk and control personnel. And on top of that, we will try and get a number of years of performance data going back a number of years to be able to test, so what have their outcomes been, and on what basis were those decisions made. We'll also compare that to board remuneration committee papers and talk to board remuneration committees themselves to understand how did you make a decision about decreasing or increasing somebody's bonus here or there. That should give us a really good sense of what's actually happening in the marketplace right now in terms of remuneration practices and outcomes. In our engagement with institutions on culture, this came up a lot, and the vast majority of the feedback we got was that industry was telling us that there are issues in this space. They're finding it very hard to categorically say that their incentive arrangements truly do align to the long-term financial health of their organisations. So I suspect there may be some issues that we uncover here, but it sounds like it won't be a surprise. So we need to get to the bottom of that. And again, we're interested in this space to make sure that remuneration arrangements support risk cultures of institutions. There needs to be that connection there. I'm not sure to what degree that exists right now. And so the reason why we have culture and REM in one team is to try and make that connection. On governance, so broadly speaking, so CPS and SPS 510 is our governance standard, and broadly speaking, our requirements in there are pretty much market leading in many respects in terms of what we require in that space. Some of you may be familiar with the UK senior managers regime and what they're doing over there. It's a very different prescriptive type of framework. We'll be looking at that to understand, well, is there anything in there for us? We're not sure at this point, but out of a prioritisation of all of our work, governance is the third priority. Culture and remuneration are clearly our topics of focus. And a question I get a lot from institutions is, so what does this all mean for us? When are you going to change things, if you're going to change things? Our view is, we don't know if we're going to change things, but if we do, it would be 2018 at the earliest that we would go out to consult with industry, we think, particularly on culture and remuneration. Lastly, if there's things you're going to take away from this, this is really the slide I'm keen for you to take away if you can. What's APRA's objectives here? We want financial institutions, regulated financial institutions, to establish and maintain sound risk cultures. And we think it makes sense that their risk cultures be aligned to the values and purpose of that organisation, for reasons I mentioned before. But importantly, we want industry to lead the work in this space, we are really cognizant of the fact that if APRA leads the work and becomes prescriptive in this space, we'll get a compliance response from industry, where industry will be saying to us, "Well, give us a checklist, we'll tick it off, and here's our good risk culture." That's not what we want to do. So we are pushing pretty hard at the board level, at the senior executive level, to say, we're putting this on you, and we are keen to see progress in this space. But we do acknowledge, and that's the left-hand box on the bottom, expertise on risk culture is not widespread yet. It needs to grow, it needs to develop, it needs to mature. That's going to take time. We know that. So we won't be going out to institutions tomorrow saying, tell us your risk culture, let's assess that. Is it bad? That's it, you're going to get a stick. It is supporting industry to understand and make it clear to them, this is important. You need to dedicate time, effort, resources to properly understand this so we can actually make meaningful change going forward. And the last box there is, and reflects this point, is we're going to supervise, not regulate culture. We don't think you can regulate culture. You can't regulate a culture into existence. What you can do is supervise it, assess it, and provide feedback to institutions to say, this is what we're seeing. And we think by doing all of this, we're going to reduce the possibilities of undesirable behaviours to really jeopardise the financial health of the institutions that we supervise, which ultimately is at the core of APRA's mandate. Okay, so that's the presentation. Q&A, we can go, happy to answer as many questions as you want. I think there's a microphone that's floating around. So if you do have a question, can you please wait for the microphone so they can get you and the people on the webinar can hear you as well. All right, any courageous first takers?
Hi, thank you. So Greg Medcraft from ASIC has shared some similar views, like with the bad apples, addressing root cause, that kind of thing. How much crossover do you see with what ASIC may or may not plan to do with what you guys are already doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we engage heavily with ASIC in this space. And in fact, they've just recently established their own culture team. And somebody from that team has been seconded into my team. So we have ongoing dialogue with what they're doing in this space. It's critical that we're aligned here. We have different objectives. They're a conduct regulator. We are not. But there's going to be similar information that we will be interested in, but we'll take different action and we'll have a different perspective on why it's important for each of us. So yeah, it's critically important that we're aligned, but similar to industry, we're just developing our thoughts as well, same as ASIC. So in that development, we're trying to be as harmonised and aligned as possible. What would be a bad outcome is APRA and ASIC having very different perspectives on this, and then an institution having to face that and deal with that. We don't think that's right, and we're both aware of that, so we're trying to make sure that we are aligned as much as we can be.
So just to follow up with that, the people who are then looking at risk culture, should they be looking at conduct at the same time in the near future?
Possibly. So conduct is one of those potential signals that gives us as a prudential regulator a flag of maybe we need to look into this a bit further. Typically, a consumer outcome is not our focus, but what we were interested in is what does this mean for how the organisation is run in that team, in that broader unit, in that division, and what could that be telling us about the effectiveness of the risk management framework and generally the riskiness of the organisation. So it could absolutely factor in our thinking, but I imagine an action ASIC would need to take in a situation where perhaps it is a bit more contained in terms of a misconduct issue could be very different to the action we would take. Any other questions? That was crystal clear.
Hi, thanks very much for your interesting presentation. Phil Morley from Swiss Re. I guess APRA is also on a bit of a change management journey here because this is new for the supervisors that look after the regulated entities. What does that look like from APRA's perspective? How has APRA had to adapt and change the way it thinks about risk?
Yeah, there's a couple of answers to that. One would be on the supervisory front. There will be an extensive education process we will need to go through, and we're not even at the beginnings of that. The paper, as much as it was, I think, instructive for industry, was also instructive internally within APRA. And this is for those of you who are actively working in the risk culture space in your organisations. We've gone through a journey within APRA itself. So my team had to effectively do a whole stack of convincing internally about why this is important, the sorts of messages we wanted to get out into the paper. That in itself was a journey, but we think probably reflective of what happens in industry. we think we've got buy-in now in terms of what we're doing in this space. But from a supervisory perspective, after we do our pilot reviews, and this will take about 12 months of doing pilot reviews, our intention is to build a framework that will be part of our normal day-to-day supervision of institutions. So through that process, we will have a long phase of training, upskilling, building into just a normal day-to-day interaction, a methodology through which supervisors can utilise to extract that cultural information and then hopefully interpret it in a way that adds risk insights for them. The other answer I would give to you is that APRA as an organisation is going through a pretty significant change culturally as well. And so we've taken the view that if we're insisting that institutions think about their risk culture, we should as well. So there are a big range of initiatives we've undertaken to think about our own culture, and where we've seen, and we have seen things that we've not been particularly happy with, we're acting on to go, okay, well, let's do something about this and make sure we've got some change and traction. It's not easy, which you recognise for a large financial institution would be really hard, but nonetheless, we've acknowledged and we're trying to move through that as a way to show that we're also serious about this as well.
Hi, Fahmi. Thanks for what you shared. Can I just ask a question? You mentioned about adequate challenge and openness. Are you also looking at areas such as maybe supporting whistleblowers and those kind of protections, or is that more with maybe ASIC?
Oh, look, we are interested in that, and as you know, the ABA has got some significant initiatives around whistleblowing, and ASIC's very interested in this space. That clearly is one important element of a risk management framework to have in place. But if I step back, really, I'd like an institution not to have to utilise whistleblowing policies. If your culture is right, people are talking up and raising issues anyway. They wouldn't have to use whistleblowing. So in my mind, it's great that ASIC is there focusing on this and needs to be done, but I'd much prefer us to be thinking about the ex-ante type of approaches. How is it we can get to a point where whistleblowing is actually not an avenue that people have to use, right? To me, if there's a hell of a lot of focus on whistleblowing more than anything else, to me, I feel like we failed in some way, because all we're doing is trying to make sure we can help fix stuff when things go wrong. We don't want things to go wrong in the first place. So my response to you would be really important. We're not as active as ASIC in this space, but we think maybe the balance is right because ASIC is heavily interested in that space, but we're more on the preventative side. Any other questions?
So just clarifying the next steps, you said 2018, is that consultation process or actually some changes coming through with supervision and regulation?
In all of our, sounds like you might be familiar with our processes, for all of our, any type of new regulation, even guidance, we have to consult with first. So that would absolutely be the first step. And in our reckoning, it's going to be 2018 at the very earliest that we'll be consulting on any potential new changes. And like I said, we don't know if we're going to make changes. We need to go through that process. But yeah, it's next year that we will consult at the very earliest.
And the consultation is after or before the pilot study?
It'll be during. So perhaps I can give you a little bit more detail here. So we're intending by the end of this year to publish a paper on what we find from our remuneration work, similar to our risk culture paper, but perhaps less big picture and theoretical and more specific, because we will have some very hardcore data that we're able to hopefully anonymise but also reflect back to industry in terms of what we found. So that'll be a key piece of communication going back to industry this year. And in that paper, we will look to steer industry as to what we're thinking in terms of potential changes. But there will be a formal consultation process after that next year. The risk culture piece, we think if there's going to be changes to be made in that space, it's most likely after our pilot reviews, which at this point is we're looking to try and wrap those up middle of next year. So it'll be second half of 2018 if we were going to consult on any cultural related changes.
Hi, Ronald Lai from SCORE. Just want to get some insight from your interviews with some of the industries, board or directors or HR directors, and what are some of the difficulties or challenges they express when try to implement a risk culture to their organisations?
I'd say generally speaking, there is still certainly at the board level a sense that culture is just about gut feel. And so they express to us, no, we've got a good feel for culture because my gut feel tells me this person's a good person, this person's a bad person. So that takes a fair bit of effort to get them further across the line in terms of it's actually more than that. And like I mentioned before, convincing people that there are data around culture is something that a lot of people find, no, that can't be right. That's their initial response. So that can be difficult. I think there is a challenge we face at the boardroom level to really get many people across the line. There are some really important senior directors in Australia who really, truly do get it and are really interested in this space. But we need more of that to be happening. The reality is, though, and we can't shy away from this, is that complacency exists within Australia. It makes sense. We've had 25 years without a recession. Things are going generally pretty good. This is highly unusual for the rest of the world. It's hard to recognise that when we're in Australia, but that's the reality. And so when you say to executives, you need to focus on this, many of them say, we do, but it's not a major priority for us because we're doing pretty well. But have they truly understood what their culture is like? Because when the bad times come, and they will come, how is your organisation going to be able to stand up and withstand that type of pressure? That's the convincing piece that we're trying to do at this point. So we're trying to utilise a whole bunch of strategies. So looking at those people within those organisations at the board level, at the senior executive level, who we think really understand it, really getting in their area and helping them and supporting them in terms of some of the conversations they're having with the rest of the organisation. We're trying to do that, but there's a fair bit of work in this space that's required to get industry across more generally, would be my response.
Excuse me, Alex Good from Alliance. Follow-up question to that, which is you talked about the hypothesised link between the risk culture and the financial well-being. Perhaps in mounting that argument, have you considered the past or planned research into kind of in some way quantifying the value of that link and then just using that to justify the investment that people need to make to improve their culture?
Yes, so absolutely we're looking into that. But our initial response to those executives and directors is to give them the reports that have already been published on HBOS, RBS, Lehman Brothers, all those sorts of things in which the final analysis has shown culture was driving a lot of those outcomes. It seems for some people that they still grasp it, is that really the case? But the reports show that that's the case. But absolutely, I think to convince a lot of those types of people, you need that kind of factual type of approach, which we're building into our process as well in terms of how we can communicate that.
In your view then, what is the role of the CRO in risk culture?
Yeah, it's a good question. So look, I think it varies depending on where you are in the sort of maturity spectrum of risk culture. So if it's very early days for you, I think it makes sense that the CRO is involved to start helping to steer, drive the organisation in a direction that makes sense more broadly. But ultimately, for an institution to argue to us that they have a very mature risk culture, I would say we shouldn't really be talking to risk management at all, including the CRO. We should be talking to the business lines. The heads of the business lines should be saying to us, our risk culture is this. When we talk to our clients, when we think about profitability, pricing, how we budget for our year, risk is the first thing we think about and discuss. It's inherent in terms of what we do. That to me is how the role varies of a CRO or a risk function. It evolves over time because if you've got the CRO leading it the whole time, I think you'll have the same problem that APRA is grappling with, and that is we don't want the business line to respond in a compliance type of way. We don't want business lines saying, okay, risk culture is important because the CRO is making me do it. Any other questions? From the web? Just old school writing down a webinar question and we'll read it out. Let's get a show of hands just while we're here and waiting for the question. Who's an actuary? Okay, clear majority, fair enough. Now, feeling concerned I mentioned I'm an economist, but hopefully you won't hold that against me. long question. Thank you. Okay, so the question is, on one of your initial presentation slides, you refer to risk culture in some instances and culture in other instances. What is the difference in your mind between culture and risk culture? Is APRA's focus on the former or the latter? So, our view is risk culture and culture are really the same thing. It's just a different type of focus. And APRA's focus is on the risk management of organisations because we're interested in the financial well-being of financial institutions in particular. So what we mean by risk culture is simply how does organisational culture apply to risk management? That's really all it is. I can appreciate it's confusing. It can be confusing, but that's just think about it as culture, how it relates to risk management. That's what it is about. So hopefully that answers your question, whoever you are on the web. Do you have a question down here?
Michael Storger from Covermore Travel Insurance. I found the comment about the change of the focus of the CRO quite fascinating, and considering it's only been maybe 5 or 6 years since kind of the CRO discussion came up from kind of APRA mandate that insurers need to have kind of a separate senior management role in that, filling that function, and now we're kind of steering away from more of the focus on risk identification coming from the business units and risk kind of ownership coming to the business units was kind of, and so to me that sounds like a bit of a change in messaging from APRA. Is that something that has come from, kind of led from the industry? Is it a bit of pushback from some of the insurers or from overseas, or is it kind of coming more from internal discussion at APRA?
No, so you're right. The focus on CROs, particularly for the insurance industry, has been different, say, for instance, to the ADIs, who have had, I'd say, a more long-standing tradition of having CROs in place. But we're also seeing this play through in the superannuation space, where we're seeing the emergence of chief risk officers, perhaps akin to what we saw in insurance maybe 5, 6 years ago. So this comes back to maturity of how organisations have implemented risk management frameworks, the 3 lines of defence. And there will be a change, we think, in terms of how risk management functions move and operate over time. So if you're in a phase in which you are really trying to build up your risk management framework, really upskill and put in place a solid risk function, that's going to look different to a steady state maybe 10, 20 years down the track where the organisation's humming, the risk management is completely accepted, well entrenched, embedded within the organisation. At that point in time, we would expect the CROs and the risk functions to be purely focusing on simply independently reviewing and assessing the risks of the organisation and reporting it up. Whereas I think in the infancy stages, there can be a blurring of lines between risk, accountability and ownership, because as part of that maturing phase of an organisation, the maturing is not just isolated to line 2, it's also the business line. Right? And so I think traditionally for a number of sectors, and I kind of pick on superannuation more than insurance these days because I think there is a disparity here, although they are growing in terms of their capabilities. But right now, I mean, risk is not at the forefront of the minds of how superannuation entities think. They're getting that because they're getting new and senior chief risk officers in place. They're getting people who are well skilled in risk coming into the second line. That's educating the entire organisation, and over time, that evolves into the frontline business guys getting a real understanding of what it is to own risk and to understand risk, as opposed to just thinking about selling and profits and margins and those sorts of things. Another question from the web? 2. Right. Okay, first question. Does APRA feel that entities are funding risk culture assessments investigations sufficiently? This is Sean McGing. I think it varies. There are some institutions who take this very seriously and have dedicated a lot of time and effort to it, and that's to be commended. For some other organisations, they haven't. And this gets back to my point for those who are perhaps seeing this slightly with a degree of complacency, for sure. So I'd say my answer to that would be it's mixed. Seen some really good things, some not so bad things, some pretty bad things, and some stuff in the middle. But we're hoping, it comes back to this point about this balancing act. We're wanting industry to push this. We don't want to be pushing institutions to be going hard in this space. But hopefully, if organisations are doing this on their own and perhaps sharing their experiences with their peers, maybe there'll be a nice effect of others going, right, if they're doing it, we should be doing it. Another question from Annie Tay. Do you see the risk management function disappearing in the near future? Comes back to your question. In the near future, once the risk culture is fully embedded and mature? I don't think so. I think there will always be a need for boards in particular to have an independent set of eyes looking at the business. The risks are too complex and too important to really rely 100% on the business line. No matter how well your intentions are, the conflicts inherent in that are there. And so a way that you alleviate that is having a really strong, healthy risk management function with capacity and capability to properly look at an organisation. And also not just look, but influence the organisation. So I think there will always be a need there. But the reality is you need, I would say also, an upskilling of the business lines for them to understand risk properly. So when they're making business decisions, they can take into account risk management. Another question?
Hi, Martin Lam from Deloitte. Just wanted to get your view on, do you feel that all organizations should have a strong risk culture? And is there a possibility that a company can have too strong of a risk culture before it starts to detract value, I suppose?
Yeah, we are trying as much as possible not to use the descriptor strong when we talk about culture, because that can mean a whole bunch of different things in terms of what a culture is. We're trying to use the sort of terminology around sound risk culture. And that to us speaks of a balanced way of thinking about culture, because you're right, you can have very strong cultures that may result in one. Well, it could be a good thing that an organisation can say, oh, look, this is our culture, and you can really feel it when you come into this organisation. But is that a good thing from particularly a risk management perspective? You'd have to question that. So if there are institutions across Australia, around the world, who have, you would say it's that institution's culture, you kind of feel it. And that's the case. We like to test that to understand. So what does this actually mean for decision making? What does it mean for challenge and those sorts of things? So I think to us, it's not inherently a bad thing, but it presents a pretty easy focus point for us to think about. Well, so how then does this impact decision making around risk management in particular? Any other questions? I think that is it. I think we can head back into the rain now. So thank you all for your time. Appreciate that, and the questions as well.